actually wrote down some notes while you were talking. I was wondering if you wanted to talk about the idea of beauty and like whether you think you make beautiful things, or like what you're thinking when you're deciding, okay, this is beautiful and this is not, and stuff.
That's really hard. Well, and I have, then I'll ask you the same question. Man, I mean, okay, so our thesis, the topic was beauty. I found that a very helpful constraint, that topic, because you can kind of read into that. There are so many definitions of beauty, and one of the ones I enjoyed or used was the production of a standard. So the production of a set of values. And so I was trying to produce a set of values, a set of constraints, and really the whole goal, you could ask, the whole goal was to figure out how to satisfy those constraints correctly for me. I think that's a big issue nowadays, actually, a big question, especially with digital tools, is to figure out when something's beautiful and how you figure out, did everyone hear me? Sorry. Okay. It's my first time with a mic. To figure out how to design effective standards for when the design is good enough. And so I think, should we be currently, 200 years ago, I think there would be a series of standards. Okay, so back into thesis, you're trying to produce a thesis, it's going to be a really good thesis. I think, 200 years ago, there would be a set of agreed upon standards, whether or not those are the ultimate, all-time beautiful things that would produce beautiful architecture, I think is arguable, but at least there were these agreed upon standards that were existing so that you could produce an agreed upon result that was beautiful. And I think those, it's partially we're very lucky, there's so much freedom, but also you have this question of how to design in a world where it's so open. And so I actually think this question of beauty is, for me, the biggest question I ask myself when designing. If I'm going to ask the clients and the fabricators to spend so much time figuring out these things that I'm sure about, why am I so sure about them? And so I think this question of what it is that brings architecture beyond building is a big question and is entirely about beauty in my mind. So I don't know if, I would say it's about standards, and I would say it's about arguments, and I don't think although there are some biological things that make us common that we probably can agree upon beautiful things, I think that it's largely a cultural, argumentative practice of creating standards for beauty. So I would, if I can ask a question back, I would ask, in yours, how do you figure out, when you're done? Like, how do you figure out, for instance, in the dresses, where I'm assuming maybe you design with modeling or with materials, it's the same question of how do you know when you've got it finished? And I think this is a big question right now for, digital designing, but also our current cultural situation. I don't know, is that a good question? Okay.
So the honest answer was I was done because I had to leave to go to China. So I was done because I had a plane to catch. And that's what happened when I was finishing the dresses. I had a time constraint. And I found that actually at Philip's office, that's what happened too. We worked until we had to catch our plane. So, and that's when the piece was finished. So with the dresses, it was probably easier with the felt one and the rubber one to know when I was finished, right? Because they were much more modular in their design. But with the freeform wood one, that was like, okay, I have to go. So, which probably, I don't know, is not the best answer, but it's the true one. So, I think I had another question about when you're starting your practice, kind of. I think when I graduated, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I wanted to work in sculpture. I didn't know if I wanted to work as an architect, and I ended up working as an architect. And I think, I wonder what you think about what we're trained to do in architecture school versus what we end up wanting to do, or what we end up being able to do, after you graduate, I guess.
I mean, I think this is a good question. For me, and I don't know how personal it is, though, that's the thing. Like, for me, I always wanted to make buildings. But I do think there's a big disconnect. I mean, I think, luckily at Waterloo, that's why I loved my undergrad here so much, is that you guys get a taste early on about what you don't want to do, right? So I think that's a good thing. Not that it's architecture, but you don't want to be in like certain, maybe you don't like the big firms, or you don't like the small firms, or you don't, I think that it's a process of discovery. And for me, the process of discovery following co-op was, one, I was itchy to move all the time. I couldn't, and I think that's maybe a disease of Waterloo, that we have to move around forever. I mean, and so and second, I needed to work for myself, and I had a hard time thinking within the structures of employers. And I actually value, not that I don't value, experience. I think it's one of the things we need to make buildings. But for me, I couldn't. I found, actually, just being frank with what happens after thesis, for me, the kind of rigor, the kind of schedule, and the constraints of office work were something I put in my time, but were something I am still looking for solutions to get away from, and to kind of work within my own constraints. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's still an evolving question of how to do that. And I was appreciative to hear similar questions of how to kind of, create your own practice.
So from an external perspective, it seems like both of you have relatively similar patterns in that you've both finished your thesis, you were employed under as maybe a more conventional and restrictive schedule of an employer, but it seemed that you at least both succeeded in finding extensions of your thesis within those practices. So either through continuing material research or understanding processes of making. And beyond the kind of hours and working underneath someone, like what influence did that have within being able to now establish your own forms of practice as you're sort of figuring them out? And I guess the other side is also, if you hadn't have had that experience, like, do you feel you would have been able to successfully have dived right into the work you're doing now?
I mean, that's a good question. It ties to the last one. I think no pain, no gain. And I think even though I got out of it relatively early, I think there's huge benefits to working. I wouldn't, that's the only way you learn. You wouldn't be able to, there's so many banal and difficult things we have to do that you just have to do it to get it. I mean, that's my way of thinking. And so I really appreciated the work. I actually wish I could have held in there a few more years to learn about bigger and different projects. But I think one is that it's a benefit, I think, professional, working under someone, huge benefit. The other is, how do you find, how is it related to, how did the paths happen to work out that we work in related fields to our, I mean, I think you have agency. When you graduate, you're going to pick where you want to go, right? And I think that each of us will have sensibilities that I would imagine are leading you to different, certain practices. And, probably for both of us, those are in play. definitely for me, I was looking at certain places. I very strategically wanted to go to certain firms after graduation.
Yeah, I think similar for me, where actually, like a lot of those projects that we've gotten at Guild are a result of the experience that we've had at the other offices, right? Because like we somehow got from a $10,000 kind of nuit blanche, make your own kind of crafty Gorilla Glass thing to a $500,000 project within like a year. And we hadn't done anything in between, right? So, but we got that because like we were able to produce the documents that they needed because we were trained architects, right? And also because of the experience that, Jonah also worked at Philip's office, and so did Patrick, and it's because of the experience of working at these large offices where, not that Philip's office is large, but where you have experience managing a project of that scale, which I'm not sure, like us, when you're first starting out, that you're going to get that project without having done it for someone else. But that's just kind of my opinion.
Hello. Okay. I guess I find the two questions that you started with, Johnathan, about the what of building and the how to be kind of really interesting, and also I think in most of our experiences in design, because I wonder also when you talk about digital processing and prototyping, the how seems almost the kind of more reliable part of those questions, of those investigations, where you can kind of rely on testing and working through how you make something and focusing on that details and being kind of satisfied within the kind of graphic standards framework that you're talking about. And I wonder, and this also comes to what Andrea was saying about the dresses, in the sense that I think that when you're talking about building a fairy tale, you're kind of focused on the what of what you're building. You're building this kind of narrative, this dream into the dresses. And I was wondering if in both of your work, that tension has ever reached like a kind of a critical point where the process or the parts that you're making were satisfying, but the total picture was not, or vice versa.
Yeah, I think that happens all the time. I only showed like the prototypes that I was okay with, right? Like I did so much more than that been discarded because that you figure out after a while the how that you're making it is not, it's not the right way or something like that, if that makes sense. Like I think a lot of the time with my own thesis, I felt that it was the process that was dictating what the thing looked like in the end, right? It wasn't me having some preconceived idea of what this dress was or what the building is actually. Like when we were working at Congat's also, it wasn't that my boss or the project architect knew what his final form would be, but he wanted to use certain technologies, wanted us to research certain materials, and that's kind of where the what comes from, right?
I mean, I think for sure, I am heavily invested in making a lot of things. I think for sure there are times when the concept doesn't yield great results. It's over-constrained in terms of the concept. And so I think it's important to play within a certain limit, to be able to allow yourself to produce without the what. I mean, just to clarify, for me, the what is a vision. It's like, this is the direction, like this is the what I need to get to. And then the how is the structure of right and wrong, like, yep, I did it this way, no, that was bad, that's not helping me get to the what, I'm going to do it a different way. So I think also this is hugely important, so that when you're playing or when you're creating, you're creating within a framework that's getting you somewhere. Because there's a possibility without that you just do stuff. And that's not what you want to do. Like, you want to be doing stuff that's that is within you can do stuff within a certain, time frame. But for sure it can be over-constrained by the concept. Yeah, I think so.
It's been an incredibly inspiring afternoon. I mean, I'm just amazed by all the different ways that thesis can move forward. And I was struck by the problem of thesis as a kind of existential journey. Like, I think that's something that we feel a lot here, especially with its open-endedness. So one model of thesis seems to be that, like, you're trying to find a way that you practice. But one of the things I've liked about many of the presentations this afternoon is the engagement of thesis with the world. So there are certain theses which really look outwards and connect to communities or specific problems in the world. But one thing we didn't hear that much about until Johnathan mentioned it is thesis as a critique of the discipline. And I think that's a very important model for thesis, which I think is latent in everybody's thesis in some way, but I like the way that, Johnathan, you framed it as a problem with the way, the kind of non-standard architecture that was being produced, and a fundamental problem with architectural practice, and one that your thesis hits directly. And I think it's very informative for how a thesis can be framed. And I wonder if both of you could speak about thesis and practice as a critique of the discipline.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question. And I think this is also where we can get it can get deep. Yeah, I mean, for me, the what is this question of how do you define your vision of architecture? For me, and this is where, a lot of America, a school may have a vision, a greater vision, and may impose that on its students. I think there has been a lot of freedom, at least from my peers coming out of Waterloo in terms of the overall vision. For me, I tend to need to relate what I'm doing. I believe in the constraints, the productive constraints of relating my work to the discipline. And for me, it's helpful. And I totally appreciate the kind of the projects that are moving outside of that and want to abandon that as a project. But for me, the question of how it relates to the discipline, how it's related to building as an act of building, is not only makes me feel it's just what I like, but it also gives me the constraints that allow me to tell when I'm doing something good and something bad. So for me, it was a potential. And was very important. It was also, I should say, like your question earlier about advisors. I mean, Liz Diller, there was a definite attempt to get us all to relate our arguments to disciplinary issues. So for sure, that was in part my advice that came through the thesis.
Actually, not sure how to answer that question. I think when I was going through thesis, I was really struggling with the fact that I didn't know how to make anything like really well, and I had been educated in a way where I could draft really well, but I had no relationship with the person who was making the thing I was drafting, and so I didn't know if the guy looking at the drawing would be like, I can't do this, right? And it's something that we're discovering with with some of the permanent sculptures, where the fabricator is coming back saying, the way you're drawing it, it's going to cost 3 times the cost that, the way I would do it, right? So, yeah, I think there's this huge disconnect. And I think, I was talking to Kurt over there on how I guess in the Waterloo program is trying to get people out quicker. I'm not sure that's the answer because, I understand, you have to get your students out and they can't be here for 6 years, but at the same time, giving them the time to really learn how to make something or learn how to build, it's not something that you can rush in any way. So that's what I found in thesis.
I guess coming from an undergrad perspective, I had a question up here. Hey. My question is, I'll try and clarify it. In finding your thesis to moving that towards a practice, did you, I guess first part is asking, how did you figure out what you really wanted to do for your thesis? Like, was that something you discovered early on in undergrad, or was that something you discovered thereafter? And in selecting the thesis work that you did you kind of have an idea in mind of eventually taking your thesis work to an office? Or was it more like you did something that really, really interested you, and then after you finished your thesis work, you tried to find something that really best fit, or you tried to find an office that best fit the work you did? Because I can imagine that there might be a bit of a disconnect if you do something very complex and unorthodox, so to say, that you might not find an office that can do what you're trying to do, and almost that all the hard work and effort you put into your thesis isn't really worth anything at that point if you can't find an outlet to further expand it. And so I guess I'm just curious, how in selecting your thesis did you see a future in that, and how that might apply to people that are in undergrad like ourselves?
I think for me, it took me a while to figure out I wanted to do what I did. It actually took me a while also to figure out, to gain the confidence to do it, because you go to architecture school, you're expected to do buildings, right? And when I graduated, I don't think that you should expect to find an outlet necessarily. You do your thesis. I think the opportunity to do your thesis is a great luxury that you get to research whatever you want, right? So, and it's not necessarily whatever you want so that you can show it off afterwards, if that makes sense. But it's whatever you want because you really like that topic or something. And so I wasn't expecting an office to kind of really understand why I did this for my thesis, or what it was about. But I think the process of going through it and doing it was very key to me figuring out, okay, I want to work in this type of sector and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think it might be helpful to distinguish between, what you do in thesis, which one of them could be that you produce a project. You produce a project that you can show people, and you can say, hey, I did this. I'm doing a certain type of work, and I want to continue doing a certain type of work. The other thing you can develop is that you develop a method of argumentation, or a method of arguing within the discipline, which can be thought of as kind of a more intellectual project, right? And so, for instance, my project, no one's interested in building that, unfortunately, right now, right? I can't take that anywhere and shop it around. But I think the framework of questioning and figuring out where my interests are and how I can find opportunities within the discipline, which would not have come without thesis, is something that can be enhanced by your choice of where to work, and is something, frankly, that doesn't leave you. So even though we've seen an amazing variety of ways of transitioning your thesis, I mean, I think it doesn't necessarily, depending on what type of architecture, it doesn't necessarily have to be that the project continues in terms of the physical type of building. It could be that the logics continue, or some other softer way of maintaining the interests.
So with that, I think I know there's more questions, and